We like to think of mechanized farming as a triumph over nature, a way to force the soil into predictable, mathematical yields using steel blades, diesel engines, and automated threshing lines. We assume that when a family farm goes bankrupt, and the massive iron agricultural equipment is left to rot in an overgrown barn for 60 years, the machinery simply dies. We believe rust is just a chemical reaction, oxygen and moisture eating away at iron. But rust is an organic, predatory process. When a massive, experimental steam-powered harvesting engine is driven by a desperate community during a historic dust storm, running 20 hours a day through dying crops, the frantic, bone-crushing cadence of the iron pistons doesn't just stop when the fire goes out. The friction leaves a jagged scar on the geography. If you leave that iron engine sitting in the dark, the rust begins to act like a slow, metallic fungus, weaving through the wood and the dirt, waiting for someone to clear the weeds and turn the flywheel one last time. My name is Arthur, and in the summer of 1994, I worked as a lone field liquidator for the Midwest Agricultural Land Bank. My job wasn't scientific or corporate. It was bleak, bureaucratic, and utterly solitary. I was sent to isolated, foreclosed homesteads deep in the dry plains of western Nebraska to catalog abandoned farm implements, value the scrap metal, and clear out the collapsed outbuildings before the land was corporate bought, bulldozed, and flattened into giant, uniform industrial fields. I was used to the silence of the plains. I was used to the feeling of driving for 4 hours down gravel sections where the horizon never changed, where the telephone poles looked like toothpicks driven into the parched earth, and where the sky was a massive, blinding bowl of pale blue that seemed to crush the life out of everything beneath it. I was used to the smell of dry dirt, dry rot, and bird droppings inside hollow wooden barns that hadn't seen a human being since the Dust Bowl. I actually preferred the dead properties. There was a cold, historical finality to them. You could step into a kitchen where a calendar from April 1935 was still tacked to the wall, where the porcelain plates were still covered in a thick layer of grey silt, and you could realize that a family had simply walked away mid-meal, fleeing the wind and the ruin, leaving their entire material history to be swallowed by the dust. It was in late August, during a week of oppressive, triple-digit heat that made the asphalt on the highway bubble and turn to liquid tar, when I drove my truck down a deeply rutted, completely overgrown dirt road to the old Miller homestead. The property was located in a geographic depression known locally as Blackwood Draw, a low-lying basin that had been completely cut off from the local township after a series of unexplained livestock disappearances and a sudden, virulent blight that turned the cornfields into black, greasy sludge during the winter of 1935. The local county records were strangely sparse regarding the Millers. The deeds had been flagged in a red ink that had faded to a deep, dark brown, and the map coordinates had been omitted from the commercial county atlases for nearly 50 years. The main house had long since caved in on itself, reduced to a grey, weather-beaten pile of splintered pine timber and shattered window glass that looked like a rib cage sinking into the prairie sod. But the central threshing barn still stood perfectly erect, a massive, 3-story cathedral of blackened oak that cast a long, geometric shadow across the surrounding weeds. The wood of the barn looked charred, though there was no record of a fire. The exterior planks had turned a shade of charcoal grey, so deep it seemed to absorb the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The double bay doors at the front were held shut by a heavy iron chain that had rusted into a single, solid, unyielding lump of metal that looked like a growth on the wood. I parked my utility truck near the perimeter of what used to be the corral, the dry cheatgrass crunching violently under my tires. The air was dead, hot, and perfectly still, without a single breath of wind to ripple the vast miles of golden prairie grass that stretched out to the horizon in every direction. There were no birds in the sky, no grasshoppers in the weeds, just an absolute, heavy, pressurized quiet that made the constant ringing in my ears sound deafening. I grabbed my tools from the truck bed, a long, 3-foot steel crowbar, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, a high-intensity flashlight, and my aluminum clipboard containing the liquidation ledger. I walked up to the massive barn doors, the heat radiating off the blackened oak planks hitting my face like an open oven. I positioned the crowbar into the center of the rusted chain link, braced my boots against the dry dirt, and threw my entire weight against the metal. The chain didn't snap with a clean, ringing snap. It crumbled with a dry, gravelly crunch, the iron links breaking apart into a fine, dark red powder that stained my work gloves like dried blood. I pressed my shoulder against the timber of the right-hand bay door and shoved. The door shrieked, its heavy iron hinges groaning with a dry, unlubricated friction that vibrated through my bones, slowly swinging inward to reveal the cavernous gloom of the interior. The air that rolled out of the dark barn made my stomach turn instantly. It didn't smell like a normal abandoned farm structure. It didn't smell like old hay or horse manure. It was an overwhelming, suffocating mixture of iron filings, scorched copper, rancid lard, and ancient, fermenting vegetation that felt heavy and wet in the back of my throat. I stood on the threshold for a long moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the stark darkness inside. The interior was massive, the high rafters losing themselves in a tangled web of shadows 40 feet above. Long, sharp shafts of yellow sunlight cut through the gaps in the roof planks, creating distinct, geometric lines of light that illuminated the billions of dust motes suspended in the dead air. And there, standing in the absolute center of the dirt floor, swallowing the shadows of the building, was the machine. It was an enormous, experimental 1920s case steam tractor and threshing engine, a custom-built agricultural monstrosity of black iron, heavy boiler plates, and jagged steel teeth. It sat on 4 massive, iron-spiked wheels that were taller than a grown man, the spikes designed to bite deep into the stubborn, drought-hardened clay of the plains. The front of the machine was dominated by a heavy, elongated iron boiler belly that resembled the snout of a predatory animal, while the rear extended into a complex, terrifying network of mechanical shaking screens, open gear assemblies, belt-driven pulleys, and a long wooden conveyor chute designed to separate grain from chaff. But it didn't look like ordinary scrap metal. The entire engine, every gear, every piston, every square inch of the boiler plate, was covered in a thick, vibrant, and incredibly dense layer of dark, velvet-like red rust. It wasn't the flaky, dry orange rust you find on an old car chassis. This rust looked wet, clinging to the iron frame like a thick, fibrous moss or a colony of dried lichen. It was so uniform and thick that it softened the sharp angles of the machinery, making the metal look strangely organic, like a calcified skeleton that had been dug up from the deepest, most ancient strata of the earth. As I stared at it, the rust seemed to pulse so subtly that I initially convinced myself it was just the heat waves shimmering through the barn doors. I stepped inside, my leather boots kicking up a cloud of fine grey silt that settled onto my clothing. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the tractor, my aluminum clipboard tucked under my arm. The sheer scale of the engineering was staggering. This wasn't a commercial model, it was a localized adaptation, built with a heavy, brutalist design that suggested it had been intended to run continuously through conditions that would destroy standard machinery. I stopped near the primary cylinder head on the left side of the engine, pulling out a heavy steel wrench to tap the iron body to check if the internal casting had hollowed out from decay, or if it was solid enough to salvage for scrap value. The moment the hardened steel of my wrench struck the rusted iron body, the barn didn't return a clean, ringing metallic sound. It produced a wet, heavy, and completely muffled thud, like striking a piece of tightly packed earth or a dense muscle. The vibration didn't travel back through the wrench. It was instantly absorbed into the red, fibrous coating of the machine. As the heavy thud died down, a sound began to rise from deep within the cold, dark, unlit firebox of the boiler. It wasn't an electrical hum, and it wasn't a standard mechanical click. It was the dry, scraping sound of thousands of brittle, desiccated corn husks being dragged across a rough iron floor. SHHHK thud, SHHHK thud, SHHHK thud. The sound was perfectly rhythmic, moving back and forth inside the iron belly of the machine at the exact pace of a human breath. I froze, my wrench still pressed against the cylinder head, my heart hammering a sudden, sharp rhythm against my ribs. I thought it might be a nest of owls or a colony of badgers that had taken up residence inside the dry boiler, but the sound was too structured, too massive, and too mechanical to be animal. It was the sound of a physical cycle running in absolute darkness. Before I could pull my hand back, the massive, 6-foot iron flywheel on the side of the tractor moved. It didn't just twitch, it turned a full quarter-inch with a horrific, dry shriek of unlubricated iron that made my teeth ache, the heavy leather drive belt attached to the overhead threshing shafts tightening instantly until the ancient, cracked leather groaned under the sudden tension. The entire timber framework of the barn vibrated in response to that single movement, dust raining down from the high rafters like a grey sheet. The afternoon light streaming through the open bay doors began to change. It didn't fade like a cloud passing over the sun. The bright yellow sunlight was choked out by a sudden, localized cloud of fine, dark red dust that began to pour out of the machine's tall exhaust stack. The dust didn't rise to the ceiling. It cascaded downward, rolling over the sides of the boiler like a heavy, cold fog that rapidly filled the interior of the barn. It was a copper-tasting, metallic fog that smelled of old blood, parched earth, and extreme age. It coated the back of my throat, making me cough violently, the taste of metal instantly drying out my tongue. The temperature inside the barn dropped 40 degrees in a matter of seconds, the suffocating heat of the Nebraska summer replaced by a freezing, dry, and stagnant cold that made my skin prickle and my fingers stiffen. I turned on my heel, dropping my wrench into the dust, intending to run back to my truck and leave the property to the banks. But the wooden floorboards beneath the grey silt didn't let me go. The dark red, fibrous rust that coated the machine had migrated down the iron wheels and was rapidly spreading across the dirt and timber floor like a network of rotting tree roots or a localized fungal bloom. The red fibers moved with a terrifying, liquid speed, weaving through my boot laces and climbing over the leather, pinning my feet to the ground with a wet, heavy and unyielding strength that felt like thick mud freezing solid around my ankles in an instant. I pulled against the growth, but the fibers tightened in response, their strength completely disproportionate to their delicate, hair-like appearance. From the hollow interior of the long, wooden grain conveyor chute at the rear of the machine, a voice began to speak. It wasn't an automated replica of my own voice, and it wasn't a stray radio frequency coming through an electronic device. It was a collective, dry and breathless rasp, the sound of dozens of human throats completely choked with dust, speaking in a flat, monotone cadence that perfectly mimicked the mechanical clatter of the old engine. The voices were chanting the names of the Miller family, followed by the exact bushel weights of the black, ruined crops they had harvested during the final, catastrophic winter of 1935. John Miller, 60 bushels rotten, Mary Miller, 40 bushels blighted, Thomas Miller, 0 bushels harvested. As the final name was spoken, the massive steam engine erupted into full phantom motion, without a spark of fire in its box or a single drop of water in its tanks. The giant iron pistons slammed back and forth inside their sleeves, with a deafening, bone-shaking roar that filled the wooden barn with the acoustic chaos of a mechanical slaughterhouse. The jagged steel teeth of the threshing drum began to spin at an impossible speed, a blur of rust-red iron that cut through the air with a high-pitched, screaming whistle. The open gear assemblies gnashed together, their iron teeth biting into one another without oil, throwing off showers of cold, dark red sparks that smelled of scorched bone and sulfur. The entire three-story barn shook violently, the old timber pillars groaning as the mechanical kinetic energy of the tractor synchronized with the structural frequency of the building. I looked up through the thick red dust cloud toward the high rafters of the roof, descending slowly from the absolute darkness of the hayloft, completely silent and suspended by long, braided ropes of the wet, fibrous red rust, were the physical remains of the missing homesteaders. Their bodies weren't skeletal. They were perfectly mummified, preserved by the dry heat of the barn and the copper saturation of the dust. Their skin had turned the exact, dark, velvety red color of the iron engine, their features hardened into expressions of pure, exhausted terror. Their eyes were gone, their sockets packed tightly with plugs of rusted iron wool that caught the red sparks from the gears, and their mouths were fixed wide open, acting as hollow vents that poured out continuous streams of the fine red dust that was feeding the machine below. They drifted downward like a procession of weighted divers, sinking into a deep red sea, their stiff, calcified limbs pointing directly toward the spinning threshing drum. The spinning drum didn't pull my body in physically. The moment the mechanical roar reached its peak, the physical dimensions of my senses completely collapsed. My sight didn't go black. It turned an absolute, blinding shade of rust red that seemed to burn directly into my retinas. My consciousness was pulled apart into the dry, rhythmic cycles of the engine, my personal memories of the surface world, my childhood, my career, and my life outside the plains ground down into fine, dry chaff that was sucked into the iron belly of the boiler to serve as fuel for a cycle that had no end. I could feel the friction of the pistons inside my own chest. I could feel the cold iron teeth of the gears turning behind my eyes, my identity completely unraveled and woven into the metallic memory of the dirt. When I finally opened my eyes, the red dust was gone. I was sitting perfectly upright in the driver's seat of my utility truck, parked on the overgrown shoulder of the main highway. The bright, hot August sun was beating down on the hood of the truck, the air conditioner was blowing lukewarm air into the cabin, and the radio was playing a local country station. My clipboard was sitting on my lap, the pages completely clean, white and empty. The rutted dirt road leading to the Miller homestead was gone, completely swallowed by an unbroken, miles-wide sea of tall, golden prairie grass that showed no signs of human habitation, old fences, or old structures. The horizon was perfectly flat, empty and dead. The job was listed as completed in my log. When I returned to the regional land bank office, the corporate records showed that the Miller plot had been successfully surveyed, liquidated and cleared 3 years prior, with no remaining assets, historical buildings, or salvageable material on site. My supervisor thanked me for the prompt paperwork, handed me my weekly travel voucher without looking up from his desk, and casually noted that I looked remarkably tan from my days out in the sun. I left the land bank that winter. I packed my belongings into a single suitcase and moved to a damp, isolated coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, renting a small, cold apartment where the rain falls nearly every day of the year and the air is constantly thick with salt water, heavy fog, and low grey clouds, an environment where nothing can remain dry and no grain can ever grow. I spend my days near the harbour, watching the water, trying to lose myself in the chaotic, non-rhythmic sound of the waves. But 3 days ago, I walked into my kitchen to make breakfast. I pulled an old, cast-iron skillet out of my stove cabinet, intending to set it on the gas burner. As I looked at the bottom of the black iron pan, it wasn't clean. A small, circular patch of wet, velvety red rust had formed in the absolute center of the metal. It wasn't dry. It was pulsing subtly, generating a faint, rhythmic shhhk thud sound that vibrated through the iron handle directly into the palm of my hand. And yesterday evening, when the rain finally stopped and the sun dipped below the ocean horizon, the rust on the skillet didn't catch the grey light of the window. It began to radiate a dull, copper-red glow that cast a faint pattern of mechanical gear lines across my kitchen counter. And if I hold my breath and listen to the absolute quiet of the room, I can hear the dry, collective whisper of dozens of dust-choked voices coming from the metal, listing my name, my current address, and the exact weight of my body over and over again. The engine didn't stay in the plains. The firebox is cold, but the teeth are still turning, and they are just waiting for the harvest to equalize.